In 2003, a guy named Andy Rubin, whom his friend nicknamed Android, founded a small startup, aptly named Android. Before we get into the story, I just want to say this video is really personal for me. I've been developing mobile apps for 14 years now, especially for Android and iOS, so I know this world from the inside, through the eyes of an Android developer. Today, I'd like to share not just facts, but the atmosphere, the nuances of working with Android. A few fun stories too, because, well, I grew up alongside this giant platform. I started coding back when Android 2 was around, and now we are at Android 15, and I am still at it. My name is Pavel Chekhov, and you are watching Control+Past channel, where we talk about IT history and how technology changes the world. So let's get started. Now let's get into the story itself. You know, in tech history, there are plenty of examples where something was created for one purpose but ended up being used for something completely different. A great example of that is now famous Instagram. Believe it or not, it was originally built as a geo-sharing tool. You could share your location with a friend and attach a few photos. But eventually, the team realized that people were way more interested in sharing photos. Something similar happened with Android. Andy Rubin has originally started the company with the idea of selling it to Microsoft. That's actually a pretty common startup strategy. Build something specifically to be acquired. You create a product that you know a big player in the market might want. And even if your direct-to-customer model doesn't take off, you can still pitch it to a bigger company. So, what was Android at first? It was an operating system for digital cameras. This was back in 2003, 22 years ago, and digital cameras were absolutely everywhere. You might remember those groups of Japanese tourists, all carrying tiny cameras. The big issue with digital cameras was how to get the photos into your computer. It was often complicated with all sorts of compatibility problems. So the idea was to build an OS that would live inside the camera and work seamlessly with Windows PC. But after just 5 months, the team realized the digital camera market wasn't that big. Sure, there were lots of cameras out there, but even if every single one of them ran Android, it still wouldn't be enough to make a serious dent. So they decided to pivot and repurpose Android as an OS for mobile phones. Back in 2003, no one was really talking about mobile operating systems. Why? Because the iPhone wouldn't be unveiled until 2007. Sure, people already had cell phones, but what OS did they run? If you ever looked into this, you'd know it was mostly Windows Mobile, Symbian and BlackBerry. In those classic flip phones, many of them ran a stripped-down Symbian version too. These days, we talk about whether the world needs new operating system, because the market is already set. But back then, the market was also well established. BlackBerry dominated. If you haven't seen the movie, which I think just called BlackBerry, you should definitely check it out. The BlackBerry was a unique phone with its iconic physical QWERTY keyboard. Maybe you had one yourself. When Google bought Android, they initially planned to make it a direct competitor to BlackBerry. But let me pause here for a second. Google didn't buy Android right away. Andy Rubin and his team realized Mobile operating systems had more potential than digital cameras and started hunting for investors. They went from company to company pitching Android, and most executives responded the way people react to new operating systems today. Why do we need this? We already have BlackBerry and Symbian. The market was full, so no one was eager to invest. But Andrew Rubin believed. That's the thing about people who build something big. They don't give up on their ideas. Even when funding dried up and their team got kicked out on their office for not paying rent, they kept going. Rubin inspired his friends. One of them, Steve Perlman, gave Andy a $10,000 check in an envelope. No strings attached. He didn't even ask for equity. He just believed in him. Having friends like that, priceless. In 2005, Rubin tried to sell Android to Samsung and HTC, but neither was interested. The same year, however, luck struck. Google bought Android. That's when Eric Schmidt entered the picture. He must have seen the potential. Google didn't just buy the code, they bought over the whole team. They backed the project financially and gave the founders room to work. Because, let's face it, no one can bring a vision to life quite like the person who created it. That's human psychology. Every great project needs someone who deeply believes in it, and ideally, that person also really talented. So, now Android was part of Google, and they started building it up as a BlackBerry competitor. They also had another idea. What if Android could become a Linux-based desktop OS? That's never quite panned out. Android never became a true desktop system like Mac OS. But the thought was there. Then came 2007. We reinvented a phone. You probably remember that famous line. And that changed everything. Since I've been a mobile developer for 14 years, I've been studying this history inside out. Even today, Android still supports hardware buttons, not just touchscreen gestures. And in its very first release, Android wasn't actually focused on touchscreen at all. That functionality was added in a rush, but the OS originally built with physical buttons in mind. Apple was chasing a vision driven by Steve Jobs. Android had to react, and that reactive development led to some deep design problems. More on them later. Let's stick on the timeline for now. Rumors about Google developing a mobile OS had been swirling since 2006, but the first official Android phone wasn't announced until October 22, 2008. That was the debut of Android 1.0, although technically it was released as Android Alpha. And here's where it gets really interesting. Apple had a very specific vision led by Steve Jobs. Android, on the other hand, had to play catch-up, but Google played its hand so well that Android ended up dominating global market share in nearly every country, except for the US, Japan, and maybe one or two others. In some regions, Android took up to 80 to 90% of the market. That's the power of adapting. In 2007, Google formed the Open Handset Alliance. It was a huge coalition of companies committed to challenging both the old OSs like Windows Mobile, Symbian, BlackBerry, and the new kid of the block, Apple. But Google didn't want to go Apple's route. They weren't ready to design and sell everything themselves. And frankly, when you copy someone's strategy, you're usually stuck playing second fiddle. So Google did the opposite. They went open source. At least that was the idea. They wanted to make Android available to everyone. The core of Android was built on Linux, and by license, any modifications to the Linux part had to remain open. That's thanks to Linus Torvalds, the father of open source, and a lifelong advocate for open systems. Of course, it wasn't just ideology, it was also brilliant marketing. Remember when Google's motto was "Don't be evil"? That gave Android a heroic, global good guy image. But it also created a key market advantage. See, when you're Apple and you make both the hardware and software, you are limited by logistics, manufacturing, retail supports. It all falls on your shoulders. Google didn't want that. By going open source, they handed Android to the world and let manufacturers run wild. That came with challenges, but it also made Android unstoppable. So Google launched the Open Handset Alliance, a direct response to Apple and the old guard operating systems. It included companies like Intel, Motorola, NVIDIA, and Texas Instruments, one of the America's largest chip makers. There was also LG, Samsung, and T-Mobile. Then came October 22, 2008. The first Android phone was officially released, the HTC Dream. Some say there were other models with Android 1.0, but officially the Dream was the first. It was a modest phone with a basic set of apps like Google Maps, Gmail, YouTube, and few core system tools, but it laid the foundation. Even back then, Android had its quirks. Internally, Android Alpha was codenamed Aster Boy, but fearing patient issues, Google renamed it to Apple Pie. Subtle jab? Maybe. Either way, that kicked off the tradition of naming Android versions after desserts. Later came Cupcake, Donut, Eclair, and so on. Starting with Android Q, Google switched to just letters, but internally Q was Red Velvet Cake. Dessert names stuck, at first retroactively, Alpha and Beta, then as a tradition. Android grew fast, mostly because iPhones were expensive. Open source gave manufacturers freedom. Samsung, HTC, Xiaomi, they all made their own Android phones with unique skins and features. But Android had early problems too. Devices were weak and performance lagged behind Apple. Apple's OS handled multitasking gracefully by pausing background tasks when you touched the screen, giving the illusion of perfect speed. Android didn't. If an app updated in the background, your whole phone might lag. That's where the myth started. Android is slow. As a developer, I can tell you that hasn't been true for years. If an Android app lags today, it's usually the developer's fault. Or maybe the user has battery saver mode on. That's normal. CPU throttles to save power. Still, that old myth hurt Android's reputation. The Apple versus Android rivalry exploded. Apple fans called Android users cheap. Android fans said Apple users were dumb enough to pay double. Back then, Apple users kinda had a point. Today, it's the opposite. Android flagships are just as good, if not better, and just as pricey. Anyway, in 2009, Android finally took off in the United States, thanks to the Motorola Droid. Then came the Samsung Galaxy S in 2010, the start of legendary series that's now on its 24th generation. Android Eclair was also huge. It brought us the first Google Nexus, a collaboration between Google and HTC. Nexus phones ran pure Android, the way Google intended. Eventually, Nexus gave way to Pixel. The first Pixel XL launched on October 20, 2016. Since then, Google's built an ecosystem: Pixel Buds, Pixel Watch, Chromebooks, and so on. It's all started with the Android 7.1 Nougat. Now here is where things got wild. Google's philosophy of openness meant that manufacturers could build their own custom skins like MIUI, One UI, etc. But only Google phones, Nexus and Pixel ran stock Android. Let's jump to a key milestone, Android 5.0 Lollipop. At that point, Google was kinda lost. Early Android versions were all over the place. Remember when KitKat was a literal collaboration with Nestle? Android design was chaotic compared to Apple's polished UI. It was Google's first attempt at unifying Android's look and feel. Shadows, depth, Rubin, and mimicked physical life. Even the internal style guide was massive, do's and don'ts for every UI element. It was a game changer. Android looked better, ran faster, and finally became a true contender against iOS. Later came Android 7 with major under-the-hood upgrades. Then multi-core CPUs, less lag, better battery life, but myths die hard. Then came another big leap. Android 12 with Material U. From 2014's Material Design to 2022's Material U, Android evolved a ton. More dev tools, unified design, better UX, but problems remained. iOS had strict app review. Google Play? Not so much. You could upload apps that crashed instantly or were literal malware. Eventually, Google cracked down. Casino apps, scams, fake banks, all banned. Google also gave devs better tools and encouraged use of standard APIs. That helped a lot. Moderation also got stricter, but vague. Rejected apps got vague feedback. Apple gave detailed reasons. Google gave a robot. It was so hard to find the reason why your app has been rejected. Some devs even lost their entire businesses. Also, Android apps are easier to reverse engineer than iOS apps. That added to the Android isn't secure narrative. But again, with good protection, you're fine. Just don't leave your source code lying around. So, where does Android stand today? Well, it's pretty much a global giant. Some would even call it a monopoly. In most countries, it's either Android or iOS. Some new operating systems are emerging, like Harmony OS, but Android reaches massive. Here's a fun fact. The little green dancing robot we all know and love. Its official name is Bug Droid, hopefully not because it's buggy. The logo was created by a well-known Silicon Valley designer named Irina Block. If you remember the Nexus 5, there was a cool animation where Bug Droid opened up and little parts popped out like a tiny factory. Another cool fact. Android phones were used to build PhoneSat satellites. NASA launched these microsatellites using smartphones because phones already have cameras, sensors, storage, CPUs, and they are mass-produced and cheap. A clever space hack. Android also has a tradition of Easter eggs. In 5.0 you could play a Flappy Bird clone, in 7.0 you could collect cats. Devs clearly have fun with this stuff. But Android hasn't always been sunshine and rainbows. There have been patent wars, scandals, conspiracy theories, you name it. Back in the day, Apple and Nokia were suing each other over dozens of patents. Then came Google versus Oracle. See, Android apps are built using Java, which was owned by Oracle. Oracle sued Google for using 37 Java APIs without a license. The lawsuit lasted from 2020 to 2021. Google eventually won, setting a major legal precedent. It was basically like suing someone for touching your silverware. But in tech law, anything goes. Then there was Apple's iconic patent of the slide to unlock gesture. No one else could use it. That forced Android to get it creative. And let's not forget the 7-year lawsuit between Apple and Samsung. Apple accused Samsung of copying the iPhone. At one point there was a running joke that Samsung had two designers, one to download Apple images and one to trace them. Android gave manufacturers freedom, which sometimes meant phones that looked just like iPhones. Samsung eventually started to carve out its own style. Remember Tizen OS? That was Samsung's attempt to break free, but Google didn't like that. In 2014, Samsung said they were dropping Android in favor of Tizen. Headlines exploded. Articles called it the most insecure OS ever, full of bugs. Samsung was the biggest Android contributor after Google. So Google applied pressure, and soon Tizen quietly moved to TVs, until Samsung finally shut it down in 2024. Why? Well, Google has the backing of the US government. Samsung just South Korea. Guess who wins? And then there's Microsoft. Allegedly, they collect from $5 to $15 per Android device sold due to patents. Basically, they patented FAT, a file system used in SD cards. Since Android phones used FAT, Microsoft claims royalties from manufacturers. That's possibly $2 billion per year. That's a win for patient trolling, honestly. They even joked about it in Silicon Valley. Android had its share of malware, fake apps, and scandal. Google quietly dropped its "Don't be evil" motto. The hacker-friendly energy of early Android faded. Now it's polished, corporate, Apple-like. And one last fun bit. The Android runtime used to be called Dalvik, named after a small village in Norway where the engineer who built it once lived. And that's it. If you enjoyed this, if you're into tech history, I'm really glad. Thanks for sticking with me all the way to the end. See you later. Bye.